Did you know that the U.S. suffrage movement was the largest bloodless revolution in world history, enfranchising more people than any other law or effort? How about that the progressive movement from 1890 to 1920 was the greatest period of grassroots social reform in the history of the world, and that most reforms were carried forward by women and their clubs and organizations? Well, whether you answered yes or no, there will be plenty of opportunity this month to learn even more about the work of women in creating our nation, because March is Women's History Month. All month long, people all over the country will explore the many historical contributions of women throughout our history, something the National Women's History Museum does all year round. This Women's History Month is particularly special because it marks the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day on March 8th, which largely influenced the creation of the first ever Women's History Week and later evolved into a full month. The first International Women's Day in 1911 came during a time of great revolution and solidarity amongst women's groups around the world. The celebration emerged from the activities of the labor and women's suffrage movement of the 20th century in North America and Europe, and the efforts of American women had great influence on the development of the holiday. On February 28, 1909, the first National Women's Day was observed in the U.S. The celebration, which was declared by the Socialist Party of America, helped spark the idea for an International Women's Day. In the early 1900s, many working-class women in New York City made their living through work in factories, making everything from clothes and shoes to household items and teddy bears for children. The conditions they faced were deplorable, being forced to work long hours, often facing abuse, and barely earning a living wage. Outraged, women in the garment industry began to strike. Though American women had led strikes from as early as the beginning of industrialization in 1824, the 1909 strike in New York City was historic, as wealthy female customers joined in support of some 20,000 striking workers. Led by the Women's Trade Union League, middle and upper class women donated money, arranged for legal representation, spoke to the press, and even participated in picket lines and were arrested and jailed. Momentum came from further tragedy. 2 years later, on March 25, 1911, a devastating fire broke out in New York's Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where women worked behind locked doors because management feared that a union organizer might slip in. 146 people, mostly female immigrants, either burned to death or were killed when they jumped from the 9th floor factory. That same year, in 1911, an International Women's Day was declared by German socialist Clara Zetkin and Alexandra Kollontai, a Russian feminist representing textile workers. The holiday celebrated the women's rights movement internationally and was also inspired by New York's working-class women, most of whom were immigrants. 6 decades later, during the 1970s, Americans continued to celebrate International Women's Day, and it gained increased popularity as the second wave of the women's movement gained momentum. At the same time, many universities during the 1970s felt pressure from the women's movement to teach an inclusive American history that represented all people, including women and racial minorities. As a result, schools began to include the fields of women's history and women's studies in their curriculum. In 1978, the Education Task Force of the Sonoma County Commission of the status of women in California, convened a National Women's History Week celebration. The week was chosen to coincide with March 8th, International Women's Day. The following year, in 1979, Sarah Lawrence College held the Women's History Institute, which was chaired by noted historian Gerda Lerner, who was elemental in establishing the field of women's history. Prompted by the National Women's History Project in Northern California, President Jimmy Carter declared a National Women's History Week during the week of March 8th in 1980. International Women's Day was chosen as the focal date for this first celebration. And 7 years later, in 1987, Congress expanded the week to a full month. So how will you celebrate this Women's History Month? Is there an inspirational woman, whether a mother, teacher, astronaut, mathematician, artist, or another, who has profoundly affected your life? Tell us about her. Make a response video to this one and post it on YouTube.